On a number of occasions, the issue of AB5, dealing with worker classification, has been raised, and whether the legislature is responsible for the misclassification morass out there. From my perspective, the legislature didn't create the problem. It's actually the state Supreme Court. And also, AB5 doesn't exist, and that's because it was repealed by a subsequent measure, AB 2257. Now, to be fair, 2257 replicated most of AB5's language in another section of the Labor Code, but it also added dozens more exemptions from the so-called ABC test. And I say it was the Supreme Court rather than the legislature that caused the problem in the first place, because the Supreme Court issued the Dynamex decision. As you may be familiar, the issue of proper worker classification has been a problem for decades at both the federal and state levels, with different guidance among numerous government agencies depending upon the reason for classification, such as tax or labor law compliance. And California has not been any different. After decades of conflicting state agency guidance to employers and employees, the state's high court issued its decision, which was then subsequently followed by the legislative branch's enactment of AB5. So the problem that I identify, at least from the employer perspective, really began with the California Supreme Court's 7-0, not a dissenting vote, in Dynamex Operations West versus Superior Court. And it's that high court decision that created the ABC test in this state. Now, neither the executive branch agencies nor the legislative branch had ever considered it. In other words, even if AB5 had never been enacted, the law of the land is ABC test, except where a statute has effectively overridden it in AB5 and AB 2257. So that's why I always try to clarify that it wasn't the legislature that created this problem. The state's highest court did when it's issued its decision that adopted the very difficult to meet ABC test to ensure a worker is properly classified as an independent contractor. Now, unfortunately, there's always been confusion about this because many claim, hey, the legislature created the ABC test when they technically codified it in statute. But again, it's the California Supreme Court who first adopted that. Now, technically speaking, as a legislative geek, of course, AB5 was repealed by a subsequent bill, AB 2257. So now, when many folks around the political or legislative process, many employers, many workers know AB5, that statute actually doesn't exist. In other words, many incorrectly claim that AB5 is the basis for the adverse impact on workers and businesses in this state, but AB5 was actually repealed and replaced. Frankly, there are a lot of businesses and occupations and professions that are actually thankful for the legislature's enactment of both AB5 and then of AB 2257. Now, why would that be? Well, because AB5 originally created 57 different statutory exemptions from that strict ABC test, because the legislature did in fact recognize that the ABC test was too broad to be applicable across the board. And so as a result, many occupations and professions and industries who have an exemption get to continue under the pre-Dynamex state of the law. That is what's called the Borrello case factors, the S.G. Borrello and Sons case, and the factors that came out of that case. And then when AB 2257 was enacted, that bill added 52 more exemptions in the labor code. So we've actually got 109 exemptions from the ABC test are now actually codified in California's labor code. Again, that means those 109 different occupations and professions are exempt from the stringent ABC test. That could only be done by statute, Otherwise, all those folks would fall under the ABC test because of the Dynamex decision. So again, I recognize lots of folks are critical of AB5, and rightfully so. I have certainly been in the past, and the ABC test itself. But remember, unfortunately, it was the Dynamex decision that created the ABC test in the state of California. And as a result of the legislature's enactment of AB5 and AB 2257, they've thankfully, from my perspective, exempted 109 businesses, professions, occupations from that onerous ABC test. And so that needs to be recognized as well.